What's going on, everyone? It's Tyler with Mom's Basement MMA, and welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I'm going to give you guys my reaction to the UFC signing of Kayla Harrison. If you're new around here, I'd really appreciate it if you would consider sticking around. Please subscribe to the channel. Any support that I can get, I would really appreciate that. We're trying to grow organically, and that's tough to do in a space that is really crowded with a lot of other content creators. Most of them cheat. Most of them buy subscribers. Most of them use click farms. I don't do any of that. I'm all about giving you guys my content as authentically as I possibly can. So if you guys appreciate that, if you guys are appreciative of me being upfront about that, help me grow the right way, help me grow organically. I'd appreciate any of the support that you guys would be willing to provide. Let's dig a little bit deeper about Harrison. She joined the PFL back in 2018. And during that span, she put up an impressive run, 16-1. Her only blemish going up in that title fight against Larissa Pacheco a couple of years back. A few of her notable wins, she did beat Larissa Pacheco twice. Most recently, she also beat Aspen Ladd. So she does have a few select names of significant competition on her resume. But the critique about Kayla Harrison has always been she is a glorified can crusher. And quite frankly, there is some merit to that criticism. When you go back and when you look at Kayla Harrison's resume, it's somewhat padded. That is certainly a factual statement. And when you go back and when you look at some of her old opponents from a year or two ago, a lot of them have washed out of this level of competition. Some of them are active and they're fighting at lower levels of regional MMA. And there's really only a handful of them that are still competing at the highest level of MMA. And that's a bit of a red flag with Kayla Harrison. And then, of course, there are other people that buy into that Harrison hype train. She was one of the most heavily promoted faces in the PFL for a number of years. I think it's a little bit surprising that we've arrived at this juncture that we would see Kayla Harrison leave the PFL entirely. So kind of how did we get here? I think that's important to examine. When you go back in time and when we think about the Larissa Pacheco fight in which she lost, that was back in November of 2022. And the thought process was, okay, Kayla Harrison's going to avenge that loss. We'll go and we'll see her compete in the 2023 PFL regular season, but it doesn't happen. Instead, what the promotion somewhat alludes to is Kayla Harrison is going to be preserved to fight in the PFL pay-per-view super fight division. And a lot of us just presumed that her eventual opponent would be Chris Cyborg. At the time, the discussions about the Bellator acquisition were still very much up in the air. But given Bellator's prior track record of negotiating with Ryzen, some people thought like a similar agreement would be able to materialize aside from the acquisition if there was going to be a jam up with that scenario. That never happens. And so not only is Harrison shelved for the 2023 PFL regular season, but that wasn't what she wanted. Now, if you go back and you look at some of her interviews, she made an appearance on the MMA Hour, and she told Ariel Helwani that she was not happy about not being able to participate in the featherweight season, in the 2023 PFL featherweight season. She wanted to compete, and she wasn't able to. The PFL saved her. They kept her under bubble wrap for a year. The thought process was, okay, Cyborg, that doesn't happen. And then the best person they could muster up is Julia Budd. Julia Budd, under mysterious circumstances, drops out of that fight, and Aspen Ladd saves the day. So she fights Aspen Ladd on the 2023 PFL regular season championship card, buried on the main card. I think she's like the first or second fight on the entire main card. So she was shelved an entire year for Aspen Ladd, essentially. So you can get why Kayla Harrison would be a little pissed off, right? Only competing one time. You're talking about missing out on money because these athletes are not getting paid unless they're competing, unless they have some other sort of ulterior arrangement I don't know about. So that's costing her money potentially. And a year of her prime. in essence. She could have realistically fought 3 or 4 times, and they chose not to. They chose to not trot her out, and that was kind of strange. And it makes me wonder: did the PFL miscalculate the whole pay-per-view element of what it was that they were trying to do? Because it seemed that that plan had backfired on them to a great extent. The PFL, regardless of what you think about Kayla Harrison, the facts are what they are. They are losing the face of WMMA for the PFL. Kayla Harrison was that face, arguably one of the most important fighters in the entire promotion, and they are losing her to the UFC, their biggest competitor. And optically, that doesn't look good. That doesn't look good when you just grabbed Francis Ngannou, when you just grabbed Shane Burgos, and you are trying to be a competitor to the UFC. And when you lose one of your biggest stars like that in their prime still, that's not the best look. But this divorce to me wasn't the most, it didn't exactly come out of left field. Not really. As I mentioned before, the Ariel Helwani interview, that kind of gives you a clue as to where her standing is with that promotion. You know she's not happy. And I had Randy Couture on the program, and I asked him questions about Kayla Harrison, and I asked him what his thoughts were on her not being active and her role in the super fight division. I'm not going to paraphrase or requote him here, but if you're interested in that, go back to a few months back, and you'll see that I interviewed him. I want to say it was in the summer. It was earlier this summer, but I'll find that video and I'll put a link to it in the description, and you could hear his remarks on that topic. Aspen Ladd, they had to give her one fight, and in that Helwani interview, she said that the PFL contractually had to give her one fight in 2023. She takes the fight against Aspen Ladd basically to get out of the contract and to become a free agent. And you could tell just from Kayla Harrison's standpoint, based off of that year that just happened, it makes you wonder, like, okay, well, I don't seem to be figuring in to the promotion's plans. They're not really promoting me like how they used to. And one or two fights a year, that doesn't make sense for me right now, especially considering her track record. Like, Kayla Harrison is not a Chris Cyborg, where you can indisputably say she's one of the best female fighters of all time. She's at a very different position. And for her to really establish a legacy, she has to fight the best. And she's never done that, ever. So you can understand from Kayla Harrison's perspective why this move to the UFC would appeal to her. But it is coming at a risk, right? Because we've seen her fight at 155 pounds before. We've seen her fight at 145 pounds before. But now we're talking about making move to 135 pounds. And Dominance Management has said that she has tested that cut out to 135 previously, and going to the UFC was all part of their plan to begin with. And it seemingly she's able to make the weight, and she's going to have a big test when she faces Holly Holm at UFC 300. Let's talk a little bit about, from the UFC's perspective, why this makes sense. I put a post out on Instagram basically bemoaning the fact that the women's bantamweight division was a complete wasteland. And Raquel Pennington, congratulations to her for winning the title in Toronto, but she is the most fitting champion for this weight class. Somebody in their mid 30s who doesn't really have a reputation for putting on really exciting fights and barely will even promote their own fights. And that, to me, she is the most befitting champion of this particular weight class. MMA Fighting put out an article recently that Alan Joe Bank was quoted on, and he basically said many of the same things that I said in the video I made about Raquel Pennington potentially being the champion. I made that video before the UFC 297 fights, and I mentioned a lot of the same things that Joe Bond also talked about. Alan Joe Bond also talked about what compelling matchups are there in this weight class now. That's great. You have Juliana Pena, who's really the only person who's even remotely marketable. But who else is marketable at 135 pounds? They don't have anybody. Now, all of a sudden, that changes completely when you introduce Kayla Harrison to the fold. Now, all of a sudden, I'm thinking about, what are the storylines? We have Kayla Harrison trying to cement or establish, maybe that's the better word, establish a legacy. And she could do that by fighting some of the more reputable fighters, some of the names in 135 pounds. Holly Holm, certainly not in her athletic prime anymore, as given that she's in her early 40s now, but it is a name. It is a name. How's she going to look when she goes up against somebody like that? Now, if you're the UFC, you benefit regardless of who wins that fight. If Kayla Harrison fights Holly Holm and loses that fight, and you're the UFC, you could say, you know what? Look at their champion. The most talked about, the most hyped up person, arguably in the entire promotion, comes into the UFC, and she can't even take care of a fighter that's on the way out, that's in the twilight of her career. Couldn't do it. The UFC benefits if Kayla Harrison loses that fight. On the flip side, she wins, the UFC still benefits because now you could potentially pair her up with MBS. You could potentially pair her up for the winner of Pennington Pena. And there's intrigue now. And people are going to want to see that. People are going to want to see her in a UFC title fight. So what the UFC has done by bringing Kayla Harrison into the fold is they've been able to bring in somebody that can inject some fresh storylines into the 135-pound equation that frankly is void of anything remotely drama. That doesn't unless Pena is attached to it, nobody gives a shit. And all of a sudden you change that dynamic greatly by bringing somebody like Kayla Harrison into the fold. She was without a doubt the biggest free agent that they possibly could have signed, and the UFC have done that. And bravo to the UFC for doing that. Now all of a sudden we have somebody to talk about. I think it makes total sense for Kayla Harrison. It makes total sense for the UFC. And a rare L for the PFL for greatly overestimating the sway and the staying power of their pay-per-view division. That move seems to have backfired on them. And I'm very curious to see what they're going to do with that pay-per-view division moving forward and how something like that might appeal to somebody like Patchy Mix, somebody like Johnny Eblin, etc. Okay, guys, that's going to go ahead. That's going to do it for me. I'm really looking forward to seeing Kayla Harrison compete at UFC 300 against Holly Holm. I'd love to get your thoughts on this major acquisition, and let me know this fight against Holly Holm. Does Kayla Harrison win this fight in your opinion, or is Holly Holm going to be too much for her? Love to get your thoughts. Thank you guys for checking out this video, and I'll see you next time.